Good afternoon and shalom, ladies and gentlemen. As we are in Jerusalem, I just must quote, or rather misquote, from the scriptures by saying that the ways of the Lord are indeed very strange. And why are they very strange? In this session, we have 3 speakers, and they're all French. And this is why we will handle the session in English, of course. So you see. And to cut this long story short, I will call upon Father Patrick Desbois. He has been the secretary of the French Bishops' Conference for Relations with Judaism. He has worked for the past 11 years against anti-Semitism in France and across Europe. His formation was directed by Cardinal de Courtrai. Father Desbois, s'il vous plaît. By the way, I forgot to add the so-called chairman of this session, Noah Klieger, myself, I'm also French. I was born in France. So this is one more reason why we have to speak English.
I will try to speak English also.
We all speak Hebrew as well, by the way.
I would like to speak about the actuality of Christian anti-Semite stereotypes. In introduction, I call it the anti-Semite temptation in the Church. Under the impulsion of Vatican II Council, mainly the one from Nostra Aetate Decree, the Catholic Church has worked during the second part of the last century to expurgate of her teaching and of her practice all the traces of anti-Semitism, taking advantage of pseudo-religious arguments. This work of this worry of the Church looks to reestablish the Christian into a just posture in face of the Jews, but also in a religious recognition of the Jews in front of the Christian faith. However, to remind here or there different stereotypes which represent the Jews under an uniform treat, stereotypes fed by the image and the news transmitted by the media to the subject of Israel. The stereotypes in the middle of the Church appear sometimes like contradictory, or at least distant. I feel that there is 2 types of stereotypes. The first one shows the Jews who have lost God's election, and that Jews must become again the object of the Church preach. I don't speak of whole books. For example, this one, which is just a new book, was being produced in France by somebody who has finished his thesis in the Catholic University of Paris, has made a book to show that we must again convert the Jews. It is a typical, I would say, typical book for the ultra-right of the Church. The other stereotypes are more politics, and they design the Jews like the master of the world, in charge of one tyrannical exploitation of the poor and of the land. I would like to show another example. It's from a well-known newspaper, from the newspaper called La Vie, the old newspaper was La Vie Catholique, and with central left, I would say, and is full of images of Sharon like that. We never represent other leaders of other country like that. Apparently nothing links these 2 schools of cliches. They cannot to take out of the same sources. They do not use the same semantic register. They do not have in common but the guilty or contemptuous designation of the Jew inside the public opinion into the Christian faith. Since the Vatican II, the Church has been quicker to denounce the religious anti-Semitism in a strict sense, which was far taking in account her responsibility. She has also passed by a modern and secularized social anti-Semitism, where she is in part the mother. A maternity she is not so much conscious. You must know that for the Church it's difficult to admit that she was also the mother of a secularized anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism is discreet for 2 reasons. From one part, he is condemned by the French law. From another part, he is denounced by the hierarchy of the Church. He does not exist less to the quotidian. I always give this story. I was one day in visit in a Ukrainian church, and there was a picture of the Pope at the hotel on all the churches. So I asked to a priest, what do you think of the Jews? He told me, we don't like the Jews, but it's forbidden. The Pope doesn't want. To understand what happens today, it seems to me that we must go until the fathers of the modern anti-Semitism. In fact, slowly by slowly, taking away chronologically from the Shoah and from the Nazis, the public expression of anti-Semitism tendency seems free of the public censure. It expresses itself using, conscientiously or not, the classic archetypes of the modern pre-Hitlerian anti-Semitism, saying from that one which is being intended to the Church, it has done to reformulate its expression into a republican, secularized environment. It does not consist to hide the present, but in the contrary of coming back to its source, to understand the archetypes like we are going to come back to the religious anti-Semitic sources to know it better and to fight against this. The report of the theological anti-Semitism has obliged the Church to a critical regard, including certain texts of the Fathers of the Church. The contemporary anti-Semitism in the Church should push us to understand the easy mechanism to the source identification. It invites us to ask ourselves the following question: who and when? Who has spread the today's anti-Semitism concerning to the Church? In other ways, anti-Semitism has had during the 20th century to integrate a new historic will, the surge in the history of a Jewish state, the State of Israel. It is interesting to understand if the surge of Israel among the nations has modified the classic anti-Semitism, or if it has only been taken from his optic. But of what the modern Christian anti-Semitism is composed, to which sources has it taken out, and how has it inferred a production of new clichés that will stay until our days? I will enter in the main subject, the modern Christian anti-Semitism. If the traditional Christian anti-Semitism has its fathers, it is the same with the contemporary modern Christian anti-Semitism. Much time before the Hitlerism, much time before the Dreyfus affair, the Christian anti-Semitism in France and larger in Europe looked out a formulation renewed from its traditional credo in the interior of the religious society. Without mutation and without adaptation, the Christian anti-Semitism would not have survived. It will become one of the many vestiges of the past, rests of history mutation, but that was not the case, unfortunately. The secularization advent could have to corrode the anti-Semitism among the Christians to the point that it will secularize the faith of many people. To the contrary, like provoked by the painful modification which will affect gravely the life of the Church, it will find a new expression, adapted to the social field, which outline itself but also answer to many Catholics' worries that were looking for the cause and guilty of the loss of influence of the Church. The one who will be called the Pope of anti-Semitism, Edouard Drummond, constitute, in my view, without any doubt, the deep of the images and the concepts in which the Christians today are tempted to draw. The success of Drummond, especially from his best well-known work, La France Juive, is not strange without doubt to his personal cause. It roots the hate of Jews in his fear, in front of the society changes by him. It takes the form of the Tuileries Gardens modifications. Drummond was born in 1844. He has assisted by hazard to the military parade in 1870 that he calls The Invaders, illustration of Drummond. This military group was followed by another group in civil. Behind their santals, all barded in iron and sparkles of steel, were advancing, mounting on their horses like tweezers, strange personages, dressed of long brown and cotton wool greatcoats, great appearance, golden glasses, long hair, rooks and dirty birds, varnished in stupor, hats in large bows. They were most of Israelite bankers, following the German army like the cars. I lived in Montaigne Avenue, and I was forced to live by one of these ill-fates. I could verify the scrupulous fidelity of Van Paint. Edouard Drummond will take back, under different ways, the fame of the French territorial invasion by the Jews, and their deal to go back to their places. He wrote to a friend, "Debiez will be happy. Our goodness have already seen arrive and live a lot of foreigners coming in our land in France by our improvidence and our dissuasion. Debiez takes in account to see the sinister caravan, following the storks and walking in the bramble to win the Palestine and the Egypt. He will also repeat to the Jews, have a good trip, but do not come back anymore." Drummond believes apparently to have understood from his personal experience one of the specific motors of France and Europe decadence, the progressive invasion and the appropriation of the Arabs' land by the Jews. For Drummond, but for many people in France who are anti-Semites, the Jew is first of all the foreigner invader of the French nation. Why Edouard Drummond symbolized the new anti-Semitism in France? Why are we coming back to these cliches? For two reasons. First of all, because he formalized in many popular works the narrations of the Christian anti-Semitism in the way to the secularization. In other way, he succeeds that his work will be read by the priests, especially the priests in the countryside. He explains himself about that many times in his books. He opened annually a concourse of anti-Semitism. The first 3 years, the winners of the concourse were priests. Edouard Drummond, the Christian anti-Semitism and the modernity. If the image of Edouard Drummond cannot be taken away from the anti-Semitism universe of his time, it will become a reference in the foundation of the modern anti-Semitism. Why? First of all, it was him who, in an editorialist movement without precedence, diffused in the interior of the church, even in the small villages, stereotypes apparently will disparate that today reappear, like redemption of the Hitlerism according to Bernano's affirmation, Hitler nous a pourri l'antisémitisme. Edouard Drummond's success is first of all of an editorial cause. La France Juive was becoming one of the bestsellers of the 19th century. I read an article with Paris in Figaro. It is in this point of view that this book seems to me a menace, and when I see the germ of a Catholic socialism, which will call the unhappy to the rescue against the rich, Jews and Republicans, like the Republicans will excite them against the clergy and the budget of the cults. The critic of the Figaro designed in fact the Drummond's book substance. His book knew 200 editions between 86 and 1920. With sales of about 60,000 of books in the first year, Drummond reviled with Zola. Drummond associated in his thoughts traditional Catholic nationalism with revolutionary thoughts drive against the Jew. This narrative association is translated rapidly by a rallying of non-Catholics according to their point of view, which permits after the foundation of the Anti-Semite League. Not so many remember that the appearance of his book was in the middle of an editorial movement, which took also the appearance of a newspaper titled La Libre Parole et La Libre Parole Illustrée. Frequently, Edouard Drummond explains himself about his elders, the reference in the anti-Semitism that he will claim until the end of his days. Not only he claims them, but he supports the edition of almost the total of his books, which constitutes the reference for him. He distinguishes himself a Catholic source, a Blanquist revolutionary one, and the third one, classical socialist Tusnel. He is inspired at the same time the famous historian Tusnel, socialist, disciple of Fourier, author of The Jews, King of that Time, of Gougenot de Mousseau, Catholic legitimist, and from Gustave Tridon, disciple of Blanqui, who was also against the church. In a figurative narration, he will calm the reader Arian, to whom he addresses himself in a revolutionary posture in double title. First of all, as Christian, disciple of Jesus, the Catholic cannot avoid to be solidar with the poor, like Jesus did. In any case, as Christian, they cannot avoid to revolt of the taking of power of the Jews after the revolution against the Christian order. He will also describe the world history like the fight between the Arians and the Semites, a fight that the Semites bring against a double enemy, the Christians and the poor, or those who became poor after the exploitation of the Jews. A revolutionary position in the name of Christ, a Catholic position melting the classic theological anti-Semitic position, and a second one, the anti-capitalist revolutionary attitude. The narration is going to be illustrated in different ways. He produces an illustrated edition of the Jewish France. This edition brings the eyes to observe the Jew in the historical mutation. Larger in his newspaper, a Livre Parole Illustré, all the slides that you have here are from La Livre Parole Illustré. Each edition of the newspaper contains from 2 or 3 cartoons in different sides, of imaginary nature or pseudo-prescriptive. He will use the draw as much as the photography, but he will associate. The draw designs the Jew, and the photography shows him. To calculate the impact of this method used by Drummond, it is necessary to restitute him in this time, from those who were the pioneers of the utilization of the cliché photography, more precisely people like Jules-Étienne Marais or Bertillon. The one and the other have in common to have been the first to have shown what nobody have seen before. Jules-Étienne Marais is the inventor of the chronophotograph that will open all his life to grab photographic images of furtive, and Bertillon will be the first to use the photographic cliché to design the criminals. I do not pretend that these two inventors have influenced Drummond, but it seems to me that the influence of their work over the man's eye will permit us to understand how Drummond and all his disciples have structured and formatted, I would say, the anti-Semite eye. Jules-Étienne Marais, the inventor of the chronophotography, today forgot it, has influenced without any doubt as much the modern art as the medical approach by the visualization of images, where the traces of curves permit us by example to visualize the invisible of the sanguine circulation. He was looking for the trace of the invisible. This made that for the first time he visualized the clichés of the sequences of the horse gallop, but the eye could not see because of the retinal limit. He does the same for the small fly, for the small bird, or for the cat who falls down. After this, the horse's statues, by example, represent the horses as he gallops in the reality. Before that, everybody was thinking that when the horse was galloping, he had the 4 legs suspended. The human eye continues not acceding to the horse furtively. He has got a memory which permits him to re-inject this cliché as he looks at the horse. The eye of the human thinks to see the horse today, but he sees in effect the horse and the cliché of the horse. You will tell me what is the relation between that and the contemporary anti-Semitism. I have always remarked that the anti-Semite, Christian or not, even if they have never met a Jew, they have seen him. They know them, and then they can make even a description of them. The modern anti-Semitism has to do with the view. It seems to me that Drummond was the first one to hold himself in the cartoon design and over the photographic cliché of Jewish people. introduced by manipulating the method of Murray, or maybe using in a false way, following the steps closely similar, he works so that people re-inject in their view of the Jews the anti-Semite cliché. There is a strong link between the narration, the draws, the cliché, and the anti-Semite memory of the eye. I know myself certain anti-Semites who are honest in some way. They see what they say what they see. They see the Jew, or they believe that they see him exactly as they describe him. And they have the certitude that the non-anti-Semites simply don't see. The utilization of photographic cliché representing, by example, the family Rothschild, but today Sharon, is more fallacy because it gives to the anti-Semite the illusion of an objective character. It is not by hazard if since the introduction of La France Juive, Drummond takes care of remembering that the Aryan is landowner who stays without moving. The non-Jew doesn't move for Drummond, but the Semite, he says, is an ambulant mystery. The Jew has to do with the movement. The photographic cliché of the Jew will be taken at the instant of an incessant movement, this instant that is supposed to permit to the Aryan to understand the fast movement of the Jews. The work of Juliette and Murray, face to face with the horse, permits us to understand what Drummond wants to do, work to produce face to face with the Jews. Bertillon. In 1882, the Police Prefecture Identification Service, directed by Alphonse Bertillon, commit the anthropometric description exploitation, and the photographic department became under his responsibility. Bertillon's file contains a photo of the face and another of the profile. More and more she contains a big number of systematic information, particular characteristic, scars, tattoos, nose, mouth, hair, eyes description. Since 1890, Bertillon announced 90,000 pictures. He will realize that he must have a technique that files could not permit to find back the habitual criminals except because of the tattoos, by example, or other specific difference. This huge administrative and massive solution of the photography illustrates also the photographic work of Edouard Drummond. The books of Edouard Drummond are full of photography of real Jews. The photography of Jewish people supported by the cartoons transformed the France Juive and other books of Drummond into a real book of investigation from his other book or from the Libre Parole newspaper, a real investigation works which evokes at the same time the files and the ethnic study. Most of the Drummond disciples express themselves as investigators about the Jews' comportment in the society. It was the case, by examples, of Raphael Viau, who wrote in one of his books prefaced by Drummond and expressing himself. Here is the text of Viau. It is to the maids of Israel to whom I attack myself today, those good Jews, who are going to under the regard of Goyim of France. They have most of them names known by everybody. Their names are Rothschild, Efruzi, Cain-Danvers, Stern, etc. After 10 years, I studied these special people who made bad things. I had followed them in their public life and in their intimacy. With meticulously, I discovered everything that they have published about them. I have visited their sumptuous residence without their knowledge, naturally. Wherever the Jew developed, I followed my investigation, satisfied to give a complete and absolute work under the result of the surprising invasion of the Semites in France. Always the same theme, invasion of the earth by the Jew. The work of the Drummond School seems to be a part of the police investigation towards the population who is supposed to be guilty. This photography of determinate people, followed by a narration of their biography, represents for the reader like a show to present him to be a victim, to prevent him to be a victim. I will finish by my conclusion. the memory of the anti-Semite eye. In the contemporary actuality, the cartoons reside a lot in Europe, but also in the Muslim countries, especially in Egypt. And it's not normal, it's very new in the Muslim traditions to use cartoons. Normally, it's a West tradition. These cartoons are received in connection with the violent image regularly transmitted by the satellite TV channels coming from Israel. The cartoon designs for the tweets shows a point to a culpability. The photography shows it with an apparently objectivity. It establishes a continuum between the cartoon, the narration, and the image. The Christians got consciously or not from the traditional anti-Semitism, but also today from the modern anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism can be carried by the Christian vectors as it can be carried by others, because it is constituted by transversal representation. It risks of welcoming this image and these cartoons as the actual designation of the Jew, where the poor is the victim. The image of violence committed by the Israeli Jews can only be received like the actualized and unveiled image of the Jew. The faith in Jesus Christ is inseparable of a conscience of solidarity with the poor. To see the image of a Jew represented like aggressive and other, which is represented like a poor, brings immediately the Christic adhesion and solidarity against that Jew. The image of Israel do not have, in my opinion, nothing in particular in their violence if we place them in comparison and relief with the other images coming from the other countries in conflict. But without any doubt, it will call the attention because perhaps in concern to the Holy Land, loved of Christians, but for sure because it takes part of a cliché that the Christian's memory knows. The Jew who takes the land, sucking the blood of the poor. But explain in a part why the Christian world is sometimes over-informed, it carries a particular strong attraction to what happens here. He sees in the strong way of the term the image of what he thinks is the secret of the world. The Jew, before invisible, is accessible in the screen of his TV, of his apartment. Imagine the luck. The images are going to be perceived like the images of the criminal used by Bertillon, like that one of the horses fixed by Jules-Étienne Marais, like the key finally visible of the world's panorama's problem. It stays to think the cliché of the Jew and the land, but problematic that we can call Jews and the land in the anti-Semite cliché is before to Israel, the Jew and the land. After the modernization of the anti-Semitism, the Jews are denounced from their malign will of saving the land of the others, of French, of Polish, and another country. In the cartoons, they have seen so frequently the Jews holding on the earth. The founders of the modern Christian anti-Semitism did not unaware the question of the state of Israel. Edouard Drummond himself expressed very clearly concerning to his comprehension of Herzl movement. For him, the Zionist is the Jew without a mask, who recognizes himself as part of a people and for his land. He expressed his thinking in a conference giving gift to the Big Occident in June 900. He perceives the Zionism like one of the capital questions, citations, the hottest questions of the 20th century, which just started, says Drummond. And he distinguished the Zionist like a democratic Jew. He does not see, he says, any inconvenience about what Herzl gives a homeland to the provided Jew. But he adds that homeland must not be mine. The Zionist opinion is presented like the alternative to the Jewish present in France and is valorized in function of a departure. The many cartoons will show frequently the Jew holding on the earth. The remarks of Drummond to the Zionist subject appear like a selfish nationalist feeling. Not so many remember actually in the church that at the end of the 19th century, many people like Drummond were supporting the idea of a departure of the Jews to Israel. The comparison of Jews getting the other's land show a heritage of the modern anti-Semitism, and it structures the representations of how the information coming from Israel is welcomed. The anti-Israelism, sometimes systematic, is in correlation with this fantastic image of the Jew who comes to take the other's land, all the land. Before it was the land of the French, the land of the Polish, now it's the land of the Palestinian. In any case, is apprehended like the stole of the land. The image designs the guilty, and the photography shows it. There is a second archetype structuring the modern anti-Semitism, that one which shows the poor like the product of the Jew. I'll give you a last citation, the Jew and the poor. Citation of Drummond. Who links between them the incoherent elements of this society? It is the poor. The historian of the future, who would like to study deeply this strange society, must fix everything, especially his attention to the poor. The Jewish civilization overpasses itself in the sense that it has used the poor. The poor was the example of knowing all the saints, who treated him like a brother, is becoming between the hands of the shady Jews a field of rapport, a column to prospect, an excuse to all the compromise, to all the capitulations of the conscience. These two postures will find themselves articulated in a continued narration apparently explicative of the history of the sadness of the humanity. These two postures, of course, are very well received by a part of the church. I want to say that the church, you see, has a long way to go, not only to study, but to throw away this modern anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Father Desbois, for this very extensive historical and also actual survey. Should we take questions now, or should we wait? Wait till the three have spoken? Okay. Can we wait? We are in a democracy, huh? Our second speaker, Daniel Dayan. His PhD comes from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He has served as a lecturer and visiting professor at many universities, including the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Stanford, Rome, and Tel Aviv universities, the Annenberg School for Communications, and the Institut d'études politiques. He is currently the Director of Research at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris, and Professor of Media Sociology at universities of Oslo and Geneva. Daniel Dayan is presently working on 3 books. I give you Daniel Dayan.
I would like, even if it's a short lecture, to dedicate it to a young student by the name of David Gritz. David Gritz was assassinated in the cafeteria of this university, and his teacher had a very moving eulogy. The eulogy was, what the hell was he doing there? I think that I'm speaking as a witness, as an actor, and it is difficult for me to switch between the role of scholar, which I'll try to stick to, and the role of a person who's actively engaged in denouncing a number of events. I think that I will speak essentially as a scholar. I'll speak of the notion of public sphere and the notion of debate and the notion of respecting and protecting debate. I have a number of norms which I think are important to uphold, and these norms to me are very beautifully put together by Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen Habermas, who says that modernity is an unfinished project. We cannot consider it's over. Okay? And I think that one of my big enemies in this fight is the very notion of postmodernity that would allow any discourse to say anything in the name of just relationships of strength. I think that it is important in some situations to remind one that there's such a thing as truth, or there's such a thing as objectivity, or there's such a thing as objectivity as a norm. Okay, there's a difference between the naive belief in objectivity and holding objectivity as a norm. And I think that objectivity is a performance. And if it's objectivity is a performance, then we can redefine objectivity in a way which is by no means, I believe, epistemologically naive. Okay? So I think these are the points I want to defend. Now the myths I want to attack. I think for 2 years, 3 words have dominated the French political debate concerning the issues we are dealing with. The first word is amalgam, or amalgamation. Amalgamation is the myth according to which 2 + 2 = 4. Okay? If you do not do amalgamation, 2 + 2 = 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. Okay? A very important discovery. The second myth has two lexical items to describe it. The first lexical item is withdrawal, and the second lexical item is edginess. Both lexical items allow to describe the French Jews. The French Jews are withdrawn, and the French Jews are edgy. Okay? They are very nervous kind. I think that the withdrawal and the edginess belong according to me, to what was described by famous sociologists as self-fulfilling prophecy. If you describe them enough as withdrawn, then they will end up being withdrawn. And if you describe them enough as edgy, then you delegitimize them. Okay? So now, what is my story? My story, my narrative, is made of 3 parts. First, I would like to tell you what I've been fighting against. What is the general situation as I feel it? And in a way, my description of the general situation is very close to that which was given this morning about Britain. Okay? The situation, the examples are different, the channels are different, the name of the journalists are different, but what's going on is very much the same. So I'll first describe the situation. Second, I would like to make a plea. And this is my universalist plea, or my Republican plea, that it is quite important to safeguard a space of public debate. I think that what is being killed, what is being assassinated in my country, in the name of the fight against Israelis or Zionists or racism or this whole galaxy of mythologies, what is being killed is the very notion of public debate. If public debate is healthy, then it means that you have a possibility of answering. You have a possibility of arguing and counter-arguing. And I think this is important both for those people who would be the victims of, approximative argumentation, and is even more important for the safe existence of France as a country. Okay? So in a way, I am indeed taking the universalist stand, and I am taking the notion that debate is essential, and I am taking the stand that modernity has to be continued. Okay? So I have described who are essentially my targets. Now, what is the story? I think that the story is a very curious story of heightened visibility. I think that what I saw during the last 2 years is that the Jews of France have acquired an extraordinary visibility. They were relatively invisible. They were relatively assimilated, and all of a sudden they become extremely visible, and this visibility is very different from the one that prevailed in a number of years before, because if you look at the 10 years before, you had this sort of autonomous visibility. in that the Jews of France wanted to be visible, wanted to assert a number of cultural dimensions of their life, and were very active contributors to a cultural life on which they left their visible imprint. This type of visibility is not what I'm discussing. What I'm discussing, and what frightens me, is visibility when it is no longer autonomous, but heteronomous. Okay? Visibility which is not done because you want to be seen, but because people point at you, because people are, putting the finger in your direction. Second dimension is that this visibility takes the form of a huge amount of debates concerning not only Israel and not only Zionism, but the very right of the French Jews to discuss issues of Israel and Zionism. In fact, French Jews are not all Zionists. Some of them are anti-Zionist, and there are very many views in the level and type of commitment you can have to Israel. Okay? The question is that you have both the multiplication of debates and the fact that if you are a Jew, you are automatically disqualified to take part in the debate. So I think that this is the second main dimension, the exclusion from debate. And this exclusion from debate seems to me immensely important. I think that this exclusion takes the form of the vocabulary I described. Edginess, withdrawal. Because you're edgy, because you're withdrawn, you do not participate in debates. Is it true? This is a question I would like to ask. Final point about my story is that we have reached a point where you have a number of small books that are being published in hurry, and each of these small books has a list of most detestable intellectuals. Some of us, like Jacques, who will speak after me, has the honor of being on one of those lists. I have been lucky or unlucky not to be detested that much. But I'm sure the next book might have me as one of the people who deserve being called fascist or crypto-fascist or reactionary. And I think that it's very curious to define a reactionary by reference to someone like Habermas. But I let this aside. And I think that what is extremely interesting is that we have reached a point which to me is very similar to what took place in the United States under the name of McCarthy. Okay, we are in a McCarthy era, and at some point I think that we need resources. One of these resources is an intellectual resource. I think that, for example, my resource, my way of holding, is to think of an ideal 18th century, to a certain moment of reason and of a certain model of enlightenment. Second, you don't need only resources, you need courage. In order to have some courage, I'm also thinking of examples like those of George Orwell, or I think that I had a conversation one day with the wife of Raymond Aron about a French intellectual I won't mention by name. And I said, but he's very brilliant, madam. And Mrs. Aron told me, he's brilliant, but he lacks something. He lacks courage. In our milieu, everybody is brilliant, but very few people have courage. Okay? I think we need to have courage, and we need to resist. Now, I've told my story about, my aims and what is the theater of my story. Now, my story itself, what it is about. I think that it's about something very sad, which is, I would say, almost the destruction of the French public sphere. Okay? The French public sphere, you know that, by now, a public sphere is essentially made of media and dominant media. I think that among dominant media, you have some that are more dominant than others. You have media where all the elite addresses the rest of the elite. You have media where all the political people address the rest of the political people. And these media are somehow constituting a space where you have this sort of highbrow construction of prejudice, the title of my presentation. Okay? I think that it is very curious that it is those media which are the most supposedly enlightened that organize something that looks to me like the destruction of the very possibility of debate. So what I would like to do now, and I'm getting to the second part of my presentation, is to list a few of the ways in which I believe the debate is being prevented or destroyed or criminalized. First, I think that the situation is really has to do with the major role of the media, in my view, is to provide an imagination of society. That the media are telling you, you belong to society X, this society has these borders, it is made of these groups, and these groups are in such relationship to each other. There's a we, and there are the others. I think that we are in a situation which is extremely interesting. The situation is a situation of crisis, in that French identity is being redesigned. French identity is being redesigned in order to open itself to its Muslim immigrants. Okay? And it's a good thing. It is a good thing because I think that French should somehow make room symbolically for the newcomers. But it is a bad thing when this entrance of a group is translated into the exit of another group. Okay? I think that I welcome the fact that French might be an open society, but I condemn that this opening might be translated into a closing by expelling some of the members of society. I think that what is taking place is what I would call an exercise of casting, like in Hollywood. You have a number of roles, and you will cast people in certain roles. And what is extremely interesting to me, and I'll come back to this point, is that there seems to be an impossibility to cast Jews into the role of publics. Okay? And to me, the notion of public is essential. A public is not an audience. A public is a certain type of political being. And I think the public is one of the most interesting, objects dealt with by political science. And I think that what is interesting about the public is that a public is considered as a collective being, first that performs. A public, I have these slogans, since we spoke this morning of slogans, I believe that a public that is not a public. Okay? This is a very simple way of defining, either you manifest, you show yourself, you count yourself, you're reflexive, you do something, or you're not a public. Now, the public has a number of other dimensions I won't describe in detail, but one of them is extremely important, is that there's a traditional distinction between a public and a community. A community might somehow relate to a number of values that are the values of the community. A public has to translate those values in universal terms. And it is through this translation into universal terms that a community might turn into a public. And this is by no means an impossible exercise. I think that communities do that all the time, and there's no contradiction between a community and a public. There's no contradiction. There is the need for a translation. Okay? This translation is not hugely difficult. It is realizable, and it does take place. The question is, in which conditions is this translation refused? In which conditions are you told, if you speak, and here perhaps I tell you about a little story that happened to me. I was given an interview to a magazine called Télérama, which is a very large distribution magazine. And in the middle of the interview, the lady who was interviewing me told me, but you cannot say that. I said, why not? And said that because we cannot print it. I said, why not? She said, it's not okay. You don't say such things. And I was attacking a number of myths about the coverage of Intifada. I said, perhaps you don't say such things. I do say such things. It is my interview. Either you publish this or you don't publish the interview at all. And she told me I must call my editor. So she called her editor, and you have a back and forth, etc. Finally, it was published with and it was my interview, but it had a big title, A Jewish Sociologist. Okay, so it was published, but I was a community member. Okay, I was not a member of a public. I was excluded from being a voice that could stand. I mean, I happen to be Jewish, and I am a sociologist, but I'm not a Jewish sociologist. Or I think that Jewish science belongs to a certain era, and I thought this era was over. Okay, so I think that very interestingly, there is this sort of construction which excludes a number of groups, and in particular the group I belong to, from the very possibility of becoming a public. Now I would like to know, how is it that debate is being eliminated? I think that the first way in which the public sphere of debate, which is the very principle of the public sphere, is eliminated is through the use of niches. I think that niche, I mean, in French you say niche, in English you have, some equivalent. I say niches because it's less offensive to me than niche. I think niche is really going too far. Yeah, yes. Yes. Well, I'll come back to Nietzsche in a moment. But right now I want to speak of those little habiticles where you put dogs. Okay? So I think that what seems to me quite interesting is that, to me, the worst thing about the media treatment of the Middle East doesn't have to do with news. It takes place outside of news. And I think that you have an enormous production of genres and a number of creation of genres, and those genres have very little to do with news. In a way, narrative analysis has shown that in any story you have strong points. That would be in terms of journalism news, and then you have weak moments where nothing happens. I think the weak moments where nothing happens are the moments that are privileged. It is when nothing happens, then the propaganda is the worst. So this is one of the dimensions. Whenever nothing happens, or whenever you have this type of repetitive events, like, Christmas in Bethlehem, nothing happens. All you have to do is, film the reality, everyday reality of what it is to have this celebration in a situation. I mean, you might have drama in a particular Christmas, but you can also have no drama on a particular Christmas. I think the worst coverage usually happens when you have no drama whatsoever. Second type of niche, I think that the pseudo-events. Pseudo-events consists in inventing events which are through compliance of the media considered as real events. For example, I take an example which is not directly related to this. You have 60 people who hire a bus and decide to go on this bus to Baghdad. They want to be human shields. Okay? When they will arrive in Baghdad, who will give them the address where they have to shield someone? Do you think that they will be able to protect anyone? Okay? Of course they won't. What's important is not that they arrive in Baghdad. What's important is that they leave London, so that the event happens when they leave London, that is at the moment where nothing at all happens. Third dimension, which is the essential one, and which is a very insidious destruction of the public sphere, it is the way in which the public sphere is engorged with stories of private matters. And this is what my friend, the sociologist Dominique Mel, calls the private public sphere. And the private public sphere is dominated by one notion which is essential, and this notion is testimony relating to experience. Okay, you'll tell your experience, and your experience has one quality: it is irrefutable. If I tell you I'm suffering, who are you to tell me I'm not suffering? Or who are you to tell me that my suffering is wrong or misguided or absurd? Okay? So as soon as you move to the level of experience, you have the possibility of totally excluding debate. When I see the mother of a kamikaze explaining to me how bitter it was for her to lose her son, and when I see her red eyes, I cannot but empathize with her. I like her, or I feel for her. At the same time, I feel that what her son did is horrible. But the question is that the statements she makes while she's crying are statements that no one discusses and no one can discuss. And when you multiply this type of statements, then you eliminate the possibility of discussion. This, if you like, takes place at the level of what is being shown. Now, at the level of how you receive, you have the second dimension, which is who speaks in the name of Jews. And in the French debate, it is very clear that in order to speak in the name of Jews, you have to be one of two things. Either you're a card-carrying member of the Jewish community, which allows you to be described as a member of the community, someone who defends community interests, someone who belongs to oikos and not a universalist discourse. Or you're a universalist, but the universalists are exclusively chosen among those people that were described this morning as Paradjuden. So you have in one case or the other case, you have this sort of exclusion of the possibility of having a universalist discourse. I think that you have exclusions that are more brutal. I had an interview with the editor of Le Monde for, letters to the editor, and asked him, how do you choose? And he said, when there are too many letters, and when the letters are too converging, and I have a feeling of hysteria, then I don't publish any. I think it's a very interesting notion that, the letters to the editor should be published on the basis of being few, and not giving to the editor a feeling of hysteria. And what if the letters provoke him to sneeze? Is it another reason? I think this is absurd. You have no criteria, and those criteria consist in sculpting a certain portrayal of public opinion, which is blatantly wrong, which is blatantly false. I think that also it's very interesting that I read in the newspaper Libération a celebration of a group of people who have hired a bus. There's a white bus with militants, and whenever an Israeli speaker or someone related to Israeli matters speaks in Paris, the white bus goes to the place where the speaking takes place, and you have hecklers that prevent the speakers from speaking. I'm not sure this happens every time, but what I'm sure is that there was a paper in the left-wing newspaper celebrating this type of action. The celebration of this type of action, to me, is a scandal. In the same way, there was another paper where a writer expressed her anger at seeing a number of graffiti condemning Le Monde in the immediate neighborhood of the newspaper Le Monde. I think that she thought that this graffiti should be totally forbidden, that it was a scandal. But then it is very interesting because how do you know there's a university in any city in Europe? To find where the university is, all you have to do is to follow the anti-Israeli graffiti. Okay, they give you the direction, and you don't need anyone to show you the way. So on one hand, you have to accept this sort of clear expression in the public space. In the other hand, certain groups are prevented from expressing themselves in the public space. So I think that, I don't know, I have how much left? Not. Okay. So maybe I shall conclude. Because I would like to speak of something which fascinates me, and which is a thing that everybody has dealt with, and I will deal with too, and it's import-export of a conflict. I think that clearly the French and as many other groups have exported a number of their guilts in regard to their own history and transpose these guilts as what takes place here. But simultaneously, and this is what frightens me, there is an importation of the conflict in the Middle East that takes place in France, and this importation is based on a beautiful mechanism that was described by my colleague Boltanski. Boltanski wrote a book, which is a classic book on media, called Suffering at a Distance. Suffering at a distance shows you how is it when you are in front of some suffering that is terrible and you watch live, and you're absolutely unable to react. And since you are unable to react, you're unable to bring help to the people, your reaction, says Boltanski, would be to create a discourse through which you will ask some authority to do something. And this is how, in a certain way, you can see ideologies being born and publics being born. So I think that what is very interesting here is that the discourse being shown is a discourse that calls for help in the name of anti-Zionism. But it is very interesting to ask, how is it received? In what terms is it received? And does it create a public? I think that what is very interesting to me is that it does not create a public at all. It creates violence in that instead of creating ideologies, people go out and attack physical Jews and not, anti-Zionist entities. I mean, how can you establish, when you see a child going to school, whether he's a supporter of Israel or not? Or if he's not a supporter of Israel, how should you know in advance in order not to harm him? My suggestion is that he should wear some sort of a star.
Thank you, Daniel Dayan, for a brilliant expose. By the way, the French press, we know they're not exactly among the greatest supporters of Israel, of the Jews, most of them. But we have one consolation. The largest French paper is absolutely objective. They're neither for nor against Israel or against or for the Jews. Because the largest French paper, contrary to what one thinks, is a sports paper. The daily L'Equipe has a larger circulation than all the other newspapers, with one exception, but this is a string of papers. West France is a string. So they're larger than Le Monde, they're larger than Libération, they're larger than all the others. So at least the largest French paper is not exactly anti-Semitic and is not exactly anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli. Now, we have the same, we still have the same vote about questions? Okay, thank you. Our third speaker in this session is Jacques Tarnero. He was a teacher, and now he is an associate researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS, in France. He has served as a director of the Research Center on Anti-Semitism in Paris and was a political advisor to Prime Minister Laurent Fabius. He is, by the way, the director of the movie Décryptage, which will be screened tonight, I think, for the first time in Israel. Mr. Tarnero, please.
Daniel. After the Jewish sociologist in Telerama, I was named as a Sortut agent in a book where all the French Jews who are against all the disinformation, they are named. So first of all, I want to say it's a great honor for me to speak in the Hebrew University. At that time, when French university want to break links with Hebrew University. So it's very important that French people coming from university make again links with you. It's an honor for us. And the second reason is, Daniel Dayan tell us before me, I want to dedicate my talk to the memory of David Gritz, who has been assassinated in the cafeteria last summer. My question is, what about today of hating the Jewish people? How does it express itself? How does it work? First of all, to be precise, anti-Semitism nowadays is completely different from what it used to be in the 19th or 20th century. At that time, the Jews were persecuted in the name of a racist ideology, and today they are condemned in the name of anti-racism, progress, and liberation of people. There is also a second very important difference. In the past, people were obsessed by the Jews, and now they are obsessed by Israel. It seems that this little state prevents the whole world to be all right. The worldly focus on Israel is a unique phenomenon in human history. Not to give things their right names adds sorrows in the world, said Albert Camus. Not to give things their right names adds sorrows in the world. So we have to be careful in naming what happens now in France. So I want to be clear and say that France is not an anti-Semitic state with an official anti-Semitic policy in the country, because most of the leaders in the administrative and intellectual fields object the anti-Jew rhetoric. I want to tell you another thing. I think it's a mistake to associate media and anti-Semitism in the title of this conference. Media have no consciousness. Media are only tools to support ideology, to produce information or to lie. The single logic of media is technologic or economic. As a part of economic life, the media had to sell their products quickly, and the modern technology makes it more and more fast. But the media do not lie because they are media, but because there is somebody who does not to say the truth. I do not think there is a mediatic plot against Israel. There is not an organization which gives orders to obedient media. There are no orders given to the journalist. The time of the information produced by, or disinformation produced by the KGB is over, because that kind of system does not work. It was too simple. But what happens today is another thing, but it's worse. There is no plot, but anti-Semitism works inside or through the media. There is anti-Semitism because there is always a strange place of Israel and the Jews in the modern ideology, especially in the Western countries, with a special place for France because it's history. Let us start with the victory of Israel in June 1967. Actually, it was a complete turn in the symbolic status of the Jews and Israel in the Occidental imagination. The 6 Days War announces a complete split. The state of the victims suddenly becomes the state of the winners, of the conquerors. The victims are now the Arabs, which is a new vision since before the victory. Only a few people were speaking of the Arabs as victims, and the sympathy was for Israel. One has to keep in mind the war in Algeria, which was a trauma in France. People felt guilty, and in their fantasy, the Palestinian people and the Algerian people were linked. Both were looked as the new resistant against the oppressor. It was much easier, and it's still easier, to stigmatize the Israeli oppressor than to recognize one's own responsibility in the Algerian war. So we have now new symbolic equation. Palestine equals Algeria equals French resistance equals just fighting, while we have Israel equals colonialist equals oppressor equals torture, French army in Algeria equals fascism, and even equals Gestapo. Conclusion: the Palestinians are the new Jews and the Israelis are the new Nazis. Later on, in 1975, during the Lebanese war, the famous newspaper Le Monde was speaking of the actors of the civil war as, on one side, the progressive Muslims and the progressive Palestinian, and on the other side, the conservative Christian associated to Israel. It was not relevant to remind people that these progressive Muslim and Palestinian had killed 100 Christian people in Damour, and that other Christians helped the Syrian when they destroyed the Palestinian camp in Tal el-Zatar in 1874. We had here a very good example of an ideological approach of a conflict. It had to be like that. In 1982, the blame of Israel became obvious for most people. With the war in Lebanon, terrible commentaries were heard and written, and we could understand that they were not only a critic of this war, but also the delegitimation of the state of Israel. People used the word Nazi in order to describe what was Israel doing in Lebanon. For example, we could read in Témoignages chrétiens, Palestinians in Beirut are like the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. And we could hear during the news a French TV journalist saying, the Israeli attack, it was at the beginning of the war, the Israeli attack is the beginning of the final solution of the Palestinian question. I show it in the movie, you will see in 2 hours. The killing of Sabra and Shatila were used as symbolic identity. Palestinian equals Jew in the Warsaw Ghetto, and Sharon was definitely identified as a murderer against humanity. With the start of the Second Intifada, a new impulse was given to the blame of Israel, which has since worsened as defamation takes over from criticism. For instance, the death which was broadcast worldwide of Palestinian child, Mohammed al-Dura, brought on commentaries that indicates that is not so much the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is at stake as the European past. One editorialist compared the picture of Mohammed al-Dura death in September 2000 and that of the small Jewish boy aimed by an SS in a Warsaw ghetto, saying that the former now erased the second, implying a final solution imagined by Israel with Muhammad as the emblematic victim. Other forms of Nazification of Israel have appeared. A left-wing weekly magazine, Nouvel Observateur, decided to publish an article about the crimes of honor in Arab families, some of them concerning young Palestinian girls killed by their kin to erase their dishonor of having been raped by Israeli soldiers. Confronted with protestation about this proof-less information, the magazine put forward a mere technical error of missing words and quotation marks. For the young television watching generation, setting the Israeli army in reference to the Serb militia as a modern alternative to Nazification. This wave of hatred has had immediate effect. Suburban youth, it's a new figure of style. That is, young people born from North African immigration have found it legitimate to commit arson on synagogues because they have seen on television that the Zionists are killers of children. The Jews support Israel, and a simplistic syllogism follows: Jew equals Zionist, Zionist equals fascist, thus Jew equals fascist. Therefore, anti-Jew acts have become miscellaneous news items without the authorities, political authorities, really measuring the impact of this as a threat. Meanwhile, the Algerian massacres today in Algeria, with 150,000 dead, have triggered no anti-fascist emotion. Paradoxically, some sort of unacknowledged racism seems to sustain a conception that Arab people are consubstantially barbaric because they are Arab, while only Israel crimes or attack should be considered as indignities. The ideological evolution reached its peak in Durban in summer of 2001, within the United Nations conference set up to work on the problem of racism. The new conceptual construct of anti-Semitism was established and validated throughout the world as an anti-Jew hatred in the name of anti-racism and human rights. The further election of Libya at the head of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights has confirmed this deflection of the great invention of the French Revolution. Durban, the Conference of Durban, sounded the alarm in a world that will not listen. 5 days after the end of the Durban Conference, the Twin Towers in Manhattan were attacked. And there were some editorialists who judged that America had got what it deserved. Thus, the victim of terrorism is the source of terrorism, or even the author of the calamity. That it's it. Such commentaries show that ideological bias is stronger than the reality of facts. Negationism, denying the reality of Shoah, had been the basic argument for questioning the legitimacy of Israel. Today, a new form of negationism tells us Israel is a criminal. If one asks, what proof of crime is there? The answer will be, we can't find the proof. And this is the proof, because that is being covered up. This reasoning ad absurdum was the matrix of a television report of the very chic Franco-German channel Arte about Jenin. Though the facts do not confirm the thesis, the words remain. There may not have been a massacre, but there must have been a massacre. Israel does not belong to the real world. It fills a fantasy function for many Western minds. In January 2003, the administrative board of a very big university in Paris, Paris 6, voted a motion to discontinue the cooperation with Israeli universities. So this recurrent disinformed ill position is not an evil conspiracy of the media. Rather, it is something more confused, which is in the air, made of lack of culture and humanitarian compassion, and it is shared by those very people whose function is to teach critical examination of the world as it is. Our open world, with all its other information, seems to be lacking of outlooks with open eyes instead of ideological filters. The world village remains a vain utopia when again and again the most archaic passion keep on steering imagination. In our developed societies, it is now the religion of televised compassion that dictates the categories of good and evil. The prospective analysis had it wrong. The winner is not Big Brother, but the performance of seen on TV. Information and care for truth cannot heal the illness of the soul. It took more than 50 years for the scale to begin to fall from the eyes of hope hypnotized by the radiant future of Stalinism. For 50 years, Israel has seemed to disturb the world it questioned, but the chaotic world believes the earth would turn better without Israel. On September 11, planes in the sky over New York ripped apart the veil of this illusion. The front line moved closer. The street shifted. The suicide bombers hit Tel Aviv and the world and the rest of the world. Does the rest of the world understand it? I do not think so.